Hello, thanks everyone for joining us. And I can see that we've got some participants still coming into the room. While you do come in, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Kylie Walker. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering, otherwise known as Atsu. And Atsu is a 900 strong fellowship of Australia's leaders in applied science, technology and engineering. And it's our mission to help Australians understand and use technology to solve complex problems. I'm grateful to the leaders among our fellowship who've brought this event together. And in particular, I'd like to thank the fellows from our Queensland division. Today's discussion is timely for that mission. The pandemic and climate change, they're two incredibly complex problems that have both benefited from the application and deployment of technology and from the consideration of scientific evidence. I'm joining you today from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in sunny Canberra, and as our panellists and audience join us from across this vast land and a host of ancient nations, my first important job here this afternoon is to pay respect to Australia's 60,000 years of innovation in engineering, technology and applied science. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the most enduring innovators on the planet, and we have much to learn from custodianship of country as we face some of the planet's biggest challenges. So I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I warmly welcome any First Nations people who have joined us online today. So as we move through the long pandemic, the question of why it's important to build public support for science, engineering and technology, and how best to do that. It's a really important question, perhaps more important than ever. And my own professional background is in doing exactly this. So it's a real pleasure to be your host today and to welcome the 4 fellows of the Academy who've kindly agreed to join us as speakers. We'll have a few short talks from presenters and then we'll launch into a discussion. Some of you have submitted questions already when you're registered, so thank you very much to those who've done so. You're also very welcome, and in fact, I encourage you to submit your questions and participate using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But first, our first speaker is an engineer and an entrepreneur and the former chair and chief executive officer of the Dow Chemical Company. He maintains directorships on a range of national and international companies and foundations, and he's provided high-level advice on advanced manufacturing and energy markets to both the United States and the Australian governments. He was also special advisor to the Australian National COVID-19 Coordination Commission, and he is, of course, also a fellow of the Academy. Please welcome Dr. Andrew Liveris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. President Professor Hugh Bradlow, CEO of Atsu, Kylie Walker, Professor Lynn Beasley, Professor Ian Chubb, distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell, and ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we all stand today. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people, the world's most ancient continuous civilization. And today I'm standing on Gadigal land of the Birrabil Nation. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I am honoured to be invited to join you and delighted to be in the company of so many accomplished scientists, technologists, engineers and mathematicians. I've been back in Australia since early 2020, which of course has coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic and Australia's remarkable phase 1 response. It's been instructive to see Australia face a crisis and watch how it responds up close and personal. I think the last major crisis I can say I observed was the actual global financial crisis of 2008. I recall the time and the drumbeat in Australia beginning with a warning by Peter Costello in the lead up to the 2007 election, when he said that a huge tsunami will go through the world financial markets. I'm pretty sure very few Australians heard that message or what followed it. We seem to have forgotten that recessions every decade or so were normal state of affairs. It's as almost if people have become so used to growth that they think a recession can't happen in this country. Well, almost 12 months later, an interview with Kerry O'Brien, an unsettled Alan Kohler was trying to impress upon us the severity of the downturn he was tracking in global markets. And he projected that the Aussie dollar might fall below 60 cents and possibly as low as the mid-50s. The response by the then Rudd government was swift, with Treasury Secretary Ken Henry saying, we were going early, going hard, and going households. I mention Australia's response to the GFC because in global terms, It cushioned the economic blow, and it meant we did not have to rethink how we did things. Some would say we actually squandered an opportunity to reform. As I reflect on what has worked in this response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there are many similarities in our response to the GFC. Now, while the first response was successful, as I've already indicated, it seems that yet again, our advantage wasn't leveraged because of the lack of vaccines. It's as though we were unable or seem unable to string together enough plays to score a try and enough tries to win a match, with my great forgiveness to the AFL. I'm starting to ask myself whether we have indeed lost our ambition. And is politics now truly trumping policy? Looking at the Edelman Trust Barometer globally and here in Australia clearly demonstrates the consequences of the approach that has been taken. Edelman reports that trust shifts up when leaders do what's right. I want you to draw your attention to the performance of scientists on this chart. And I note that the community rates our academic experts and company technical experts quite high. Australians are looking to Atsu to give them accurate information on which they can rely on to make good decisions. The Edelman work also shows that Australians are not enamored with the media because they are seen as biased. And the media companies and the platforms around them are paying attention. A few days ago, Google, the owner of YouTube, took action in Australia against Sky News over what it regarded as a misinformation campaign and banned their broadcast for 7 days. This is truly remarkable. Australians want to understand what's going on. They want to be informed. And because of the void left by those that they once trusted, they're turning to their organizations and specifically to the CEOs in the business community. And I took the opportunity to do an interview I just had with Maria Bartiromo of Fox Business News in the United States to make this very point. While we were indeed discussing the importance of the bipartisan approach being taken by President Biden, bringing Republicans and Democrats together in the United States for the first time really since FDR, and with the support of the business community to act in the best interests of the country, of the United States, I made the point that policy, not politics, needs to enter our vernacular. This then sends a really strong signal to business and to society that investing in better roads, better rail, bridges, broadband, other things such as clean infrastructure, talking pro-renewable standards, pro-clean energy in a way that is not punitive to business, that is something that business can indeed support. Now, with almost $1 trillion in debt and a more complex geopolitical environment in our region, a change in buying behavior by Australia's biggest customer and rising competition from Africa and iron ore, Australia also has some difficult questions to resolve. There are some important questions that we need to reflect on. Can we indeed learn from the experience of others? And how will we seek to persuade our leaders in government, business, and the wider community of the change required? Who in the Australian business community can be called on to make the case for change? Atsu, in my view, must begin to foster deeper and wider relationships with business associations, business chambers, multinationals, local companies, think tanks, universities, and governments. It must unlock the insights and make them available to inform debate and policy. In the absence of this expertise, a vacuum is filled by those with opinions. And if so, what needs to change? Let me be very blunt. We must transform our economy. This is a comparative analysis of country performance from the Atlas of Economic Complexity published by Harvard University in 2018. The Economic Complexity Index is a ranking of countries based on the diversity and complexity of their export basket. Economic complexity expresses the diversity and sophistication of the productive capabilities embedded in the exports of each country. That trend line is not one that this country can afford to continue to see. We started at rank 55 in 1995. And in 2018, we ranked 87th, below New Zealand, which is ranked 54th in the world. Our trajectory confirms an economy that relies on digging and shipping its natural resources efficiently, but adding no value to them, leaving those profits to other countries. An economy that is not adding value to make things for export to global markets is one that is not using the skills of its people effectively. The level of complexity means that there is now a mismatch between what Australians can do and what the nation needs them to be able to do. Employers are having difficulty filling jobs. Unfortunately, the investment needed to train our workers continues to lag. And given the ongoing nature of this problem, particularly in farming, it makes sense that jobs that cannot be filled can instead now be automated, such as in fruit picking. Professor Salah Sukaira is a professor of robotics and intelligent systems at the University of Sydney Centre for Field Robotics. He has developed and commercialized technology that can actually solve this problem. Why isn't it on every farm yet? Our decline coincides with an increase in exports of resources and agriculture to our northern neighbours. This over-reliance on one major customer that consumes 40% of our exports has ended up weakening our resolve for reform. And despite these challenges, we remain among the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world for now. Anyone who has read my book, Make It in America, will know that the United States suffered when it manufactured less in their country. President Obama noticed this and invited me to work with him in rebuilding the nation's manufacturing capability for modern times. This took the form of 11 sectorial hubs specializing in specific technologies and industries, vertical, and encouraging ecosystems to grow around them. This is a list of the 20 largest companies by market capitalization from 1989 and 2021. It is formidable, and it's a list assembled by Berkshire Hathaway. And many of the companies are actually from the United States, which is no surprise. But this list does not include an Australian company. It's unlikely that we will produce enough companies to increase our chances of launching companies onto this list if we do not change the trend reported by Startup Muster Report of 2018, which featured analysis by CSIRO's Data 61. This report shows growth in startups in Australia until 2017, followed by a sharp decline of 12% to 2018. I cannot tell what happened since then, because after 5 years of data gathering, this research is no longer funded. And while PitchBook data seed stage investments increased from 2015 and through to 2017, they declined for the next 3 years with a total reduction of 60%. And the early stage venture capital limited partnerships registration database shows registration increasing each year until 2017, then dropping off in subsequent years. And the Startups Crossroad report for 2020 tells us that both the number of deals and the aggregate dollars invested in early stage Australian startups between June 2014 and 2019 has actually fallen. With Australia spending between somewhere Australian dollars 6 billion and Australian dollars 10 billion a year across 150 budget line items, as estimated by Emeritus Professor Roy Green on his innovation op-ed, these results are concerning. By spreading the investment so thin, the impact is lost, the return on investment is low, and there is no purpose. Now, I see a similar problem with our free trade agreements. The effort was put into negotiating and signing them, but then the opportunities don't have the next act of actually maximizing the opportunity. And here's a chart my team pulled together from published statistics that demonstrate the trading goods between Australia and the United States with whom we signed an FTA in 2005. The question is, why are we continually in deficit for this entire period? And why is this something we seem to want to celebrate? That's certainly not the case with many countries, including Ireland. We find the same pattern in our significant investment in research and our weak results on commercialization, where we rank amongst the lowest performers globally. And why is this so? This normally happens when global multinationals operating in a market actually just send their sales teams, not their product development teams, who benefit from the research being done at local research universities and institutions. Who should be pointing out that global companies should bring their R&D here? This is another important contribution I believe Atsu can make. Unlike our Chinese neighbors, we have not attracted the factories, nor the research and development, nor the production facilities that are needed to then develop the next generation of products, giving us a competitive advantage. In 1990, when I visited China, there were only 4 foreign-owned R&D centers. 20 years later, there were 40,000. We seem to have lost sight of the fact that when we own production, we own research and development. And if we own research and development, we own the next generation products. This then becomes a competitive advantage. And manufacturing then becomes a capability. And a modern manufacturing initiative becomes an ecosystem. And as every engineer will then tell you, the ecosystem of manufacturing is from research to prototyping, to production and scaling and selling and designing the prototype for the next product. I would be disappointed if those listening today thought I was discounting the efforts of so many successful companies across the country that are actually doing these things. I'm in fact suggesting we need more of these companies clustered around specific sectors and supported by more complete ecosystems. And that is the problem, the challenge, and the mission I suggest that Atsu community can take up. And the Australian Design Council, of which I'm a part of, will actually be running national design challenges using a design-led framework to apply design thinking into as a strategy for sectors with comparative advantage to unlock our competitive advantage. Another opportunity for the Atsu community to engage. Now, I was recently exposed to some researchers, some PhDs, who presented to me groundbreaking research that they were doing in green hydrogen. It would go a long way to addressing the competitiveness of electrolyzers, actually, which, as a side note, were in fact first developed by the company I worked for, Dow, over 100 years ago. Electrolyzers and electrolysis is a capability, and we don't currently have that in Australia. And it's a critical requirement for the production of green hydrogen, which is getting a lot of airplay. I was impressed by what I was seeing, and I asked whether, in fact, they were talking to the business community. The answer was sadly no, that they were actually more interested in funding and producing a research report. I know that that wasn't the answer, so I pushed them harder. And they basically said that there were no local companies interested. So I've since brokered them to talk to some global investors, and sadly, it'll follow the path of many other examples of great Australian research and go overseas. I have no doubt that this is happening in research labs throughout the country, and this must be arrested. I understand we had a program called ON, O-N, that was designed to actually skill researchers in commercialization activities. Great, I thought. When can I see it already? And when can I see it in action? Sadly, it's no longer funded. So let's talk about investment. Alan Kohler recently published a piece in the New Daily with a thesis that SaaS companies, software as a service companies, weren't really tech companies and were receiving more funding than they deserve, while deep tech, deep science companies, modern manufacturing companies who were building important new businesses and technologies struggled. He went so far as to promote 10 of them, as I show you here. Again, we stand in the way of our own success. We have entrepreneurs launching the companies and investors standing back and making insufficient early stage capital available for these Australian companies. These make these companies ripe for picking by global VC and investors, like the example I gave. That more often than not means they are funded in the US or elsewhere for more reasons than just including the size of the domestic market. If startup companies then are based in countries like the United States, that's where the jobs will be, not here in Australia. And yet, just north of us, we have a market of 4.6 billion people. So again, I ask, where is Australia's ambition? Where is its propensity to take risks? What are the points of friction and how do we remove them? Why are these companies struggling? We export capital, global VCs and other asset owners. Why aren't we investing more of that capital here in good research scalable investments for making long-term businesses? And probably for the same reason, to answer those questions, that we don't use public-private partnerships to increase collaboration and create opportunities for growing new sectors. And in fact, really like countries like as small as Luxembourg and Singapore are doing. So let me toggle over to some good news. We've started the work of building a modern manufacturing economy in Australia. This follows on from the work we did last year as part of the NCCC process. It's been launched as the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, and it focuses on building out sectors around which ecosystems will form and from which winners will emerge, meaning that Australia can start winning in key parts of key sectors and key sectorial value chains. This strategy is about building sectorial strength that will endure. The world's leading nations are sitting at around Industry 4.0, and I'm thinking about Germany when I make that statement. Australian industry is regarded by many around the world as hovering around Industry 2.0, and some might argue maybe as Industry 3.0. Our opportunity is to hop, skip, and jump over to Industry 5.0. And the opportunity is there for members of Atsu, the leaders of science, technology, engineering, and math in this country, to lead the way with great research that contributes to the success of the businesses with whom that the collaboration to lead in these fields globally. So you see the sectors chosen: space, medical products, resources, technology, and critical minerals. I'm delighted to see actually that we can see space as one of those industries as we grow and in fact make ourselves winners in the space industry. We already have precision agriculture, marine tracking, border security, and even the timing for financial transactions relying heavily on space. Australia's capability in the mining and oil and gas sectors around remote asset management really gives us a suite of technologies that allow huge logistic trains to be operated with a minimal number of people in a very safe way is also important, because that's the technology actually that you need to look at for the exploration of space and going to the moon. And I'm encouraged by Australia building its capability in resources technology and critical minerals processing. Australia's Robin Denholm, the chairman of Tesla, observed in the AFR recently that Tesla alone will consume more than Australian dollars 1 billion of Australian lithium, nickel, and other critical and rare earth minerals for batteries and electric motors. By 2030, there's an expectation that the lithium-ion battery market will be worth over Australian $400 billion, which is 8 times the revenue generated by coal exports in 2020. Tesla has since announced that will actually be sourcing nickel from BHP. And as a complete aside, but relevant, with Lucid Motors just recently launched on the NASDAQ, which I chair, we have the 2 largest EV companies in the world, chaired by Aussies. I was also delighted, actually, speaking to home territory, to see an Indigenous business thriving in my hometown of Darwin. The Kakadu Plum Company is an Indigenous-owned business that supplies fresh Kakadu plums, as well as a powder version made from freeze-dried Kakadu plums produced in Darwin, an example of value add that I was referring to. The Australian Design Council has been collaborating with Food Innovation Australia and profiled a number of Australian businesses in the food and agribusiness sector and use a design-led mindset and practices to grow their business. The food and agriculture sector was selected based on the potential for growth from a $61 billion sector to a $200 billion sector by 2030. By building out a circular economy, we have a profitable and sustainable economy, a healthy environment, and a more conscious and connected society. And finally, clean energy, which should not be an issue for a nation with an abundance of natural resources above the ground, including plentiful sunshine and wind and water power. So here's a playbook for Atsu to think about and adopting it. And I'll just highlight 4. Securing bipartisan support for industry and innovation policies that take a long-term focus. Establishing deeper and closer ties between business and research so we can improve our rate of commercialization. Unlocking capital to fuel growth of companies and scale them globally to employ more Australians and attract the talent we need to compete. Negotiating 21st century public-private partnerships designed to increase collaboration and create opportunities for growing new sectors. And like China, Israel, Ireland, and others, we need to get much better at engaging with our diaspora. One thing is clear, it's time for action. The strategy must now be delivery. You know, Dow, the company I ran, was transformed from a cyclical chemicals company into one powered by science, driven by innovation, and delivering solutions to this complex world of ours. And during my tenure as CEO, it has delivered meaningful science-based innovations at a rate of 10 times as many experiments as the old Dow of a decade ago, and 8 times as many patents of the Dow of 10 years ago. We had huge motivations. We had ambitions to act. We had a burning platform. One of my goals in my second act is that I want to capture the lessons learned and make them available for a next generation of leaders. We need bold and courageous leadership like never before that takes transformational thinking to become the linchpin for grand scale, transformative and sustainable change, which is why I've made my philanthropic gift to the University of Queensland, which has built the Academy for Innovation and Leadership. My commitment to the Atsu community is this: they figure out the what, I'm going to help you with the how. And finally, when I turn to our situation in Australia, I think of Thomas Edison's aphorism, good fortune is what happens when opportunity meets with planning. Well, we now have a plan. We now have a top-down policy and framework. Australia's innovation opportunity now is a path to progress in the form of the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, and Atsu's contribution is vital to its success. If there's a door you need opened and I have the key, I'll be there to help you unlock the door. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that provocative opening discussion, Andrew. It's much appreciated. I'm now going to introduce the rest of our panelists, and we're going to launch straight into a discussion around the theme of building public support for science, engineering and technology. Our first panelist is a futurist, anthropologist and technologist. Genevieve Bell. Professor Genevieve Bell is Director of the School of Cybernetics and the 3A Institute at the Australian National University, and she's a Senior Fellow at Intel. She's best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice and technology development. And our second panelist is Professor Lynn Beasley. She's had a long and distinguished career as a biomedical researcher in the field of neuroscience, and she works to support health, environmental, equity and education programs across Australia. As the former Chief Scientist for Western Australia, she's also no stranger to advocating for science with politics, policymakers and the public. And finally, we welcome the former Chief Scientist for Australia and former Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University, Professor Ian Chubb. Now, as Chief Scientist, Ian was a strong and consistent advocate for a more proactive approach to sharing broadly the stories of Australian scientific success, and his mantra of passion, persistence and patience really resonated throughout the sector. It's a mantra that we may all have cause to call on now. So welcome all of the panellists. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to invite Genevieve to respond first, and I think one of the issues that Andrew's speech raised was the idea of where is Australia's ambition next best placed, and our different kind of ranking in those global indices. So I want to ask you, Genevieve, with your probably your futurist and your technology and your anthropology hat on, if in a post-COVID world and an era of climate change, the more successful rising nations economically are going to be the ones that listen to and respond to and act on evidence and scientific advice?
Okay, that's a big question, Kylie. I mean, the answer to that, at one hand, is obviously yes, but I think in order to make it happen, there's a number 9 I would add to Andrew's list of what are the things you need to do. Because when you look at what it is going to take to mobilize a nation, its scientists, its researchers, its engineers, and its policymakers, it's not solely about the economic pieces and the upskilling and all of those. It's also about what is the story you're going to tell, how are you going to activate people's imaginations, how are you going to find a story to tell about the future that you want to arrive in and why you are going to arrive there. And there's something about how we have a responsibility as technologists, as engineers, to not only be just the facts, but also being able to tell a story, not in the sense of a frippery, but in the sense of think about the nations that have successfully galvanized their populations, it has been because they've wrapped a set of narratives and touch points around their story, right? So, you know, thinking about how do we become more than just a dig it and ship it somewhere else is how we tell a different set of stories about who we are and what we want to do. And for me, there's a piece here about a responsibility in engaging with the public is also about engaging their imaginations and, frankly, in that sense, engaging their fears, and of honoring and recognizing them and then replacing them with fact-based and forward-looking, and I always think a little bit of you know, optimism without erasing all the complexity. But yeah, the short answer, too long don't read, answer to the will nations who hold all those things together be successful? Yes. And you know, for us, it's not just a matter of having a clear set of assets, it's how we want to hold those assets together and how we tell a story about what the end state will be.
Thank you. Lynn, I might turn to you next and ask for your thoughts on building public support for science, engineering and technology and why that's important. But before we do, I will also remind and encourage the audience to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, because really keen to hear from you and answer the questions that you're interested in. Lynn.
Thanks, Kylie. And great, there's over 100 people tuned in right now, and I gather some members of the Fourth Estate, so welcome to you too. I'm coming to you from Western Australia on Noongar land. We've just entered the new season of Jilbar, when we're supposed to be having warmer days, and tomorrow it's 22, so we're right on the money there. You know, as Chief Scientist of Western Australia, I had a motto: do science, translate science, communicate science. And I'm going to talk mainly about communication today, if I may. We do great science. We've got lots of gold medals. Andrew, you said that so well. You covered the translational bit. And let me just add, I think Atsu is already helping on this through the IMNIS program, the wonderful mentor program, which now covers all aspects of science, technology, engineering, is countrywide. And it's taking our PhDs and postdocs and getting them talking to industry and seeing the opportunities. And the prizes and awards we had this year, Kylie, they really reflected that, didn't they? So Atsu's doing a great job already, but as always, there's even more we can do. Talking about communication, as long as it's good science communication, I don't think we can even ever have too much of it. I think it's really important. But then I see that we don't even sometimes have enough pride in our scientists. You know, I couldn't believe it as chief scientist that people didn't know that we discovered Wi-Fi. They thought it'd all come out of the US. I think we've got to celebrate, you know, what we do well, even more than we do right now. But let me tackle it on two levels. Let me first of all talk about communication with the public, and then maybe touch on communication with politicians. So do you remember that wonderful interview where Barack Obama interviewed David Attenborough? Everybody loves Sir David, and he's a great communicator. Simple, but not simplistic. And he said, every kid loves nature. Well, at that age, science and nature are the same thing. Why is the grass green? Why did dinosaurs die out? Why doesn't the moon float away? I think we've got to support education from the very beginning. You can never start too young, kindy and right through primary and high school. And I think Ian's going to be on the same page, and I can see other people nodding right now. So support your local school and encourage all of that. And I think, as you said, Andrew, there's a real appreciation of scientists and an absolute appetite for the public to know more. Just touching on COVID quickly, what a great job Dr. Norman Swan has done. How many people tune into CoronaCast? They get up-to-date information based on the science. He's scanned the world to find out what's going on. You understand every word, and you've got a great Q&A going on there too. What a great model. I just think that the public is ready to engage. But the other thing about the public is, are we tuned in enough to science? So I'm just wondering whether in Australia we should teach science right through school. Many countries around the world do. Israel would be one. They have a spectacular success in many ways economically based on science and technology. And maybe even at uni, we should be having more liberal courses so that we understand science and the science method. We won't ever convince everybody, but I think a better trained public community would only be to the good. Okay, so that's sort of looking at the long term. What about the short term? Who are the experts we're listening to right now? And I sympathize with the media. You're trying to find people to talk to. Where do you go? Do you go to Google? Do you go to lists from unis and from health departments and see what name pops up and interview them? And are they always the right people to talk to? So I wondered whether Atsu would have a role here on trying to get a sort of list available for the media. Perhaps we do, Kylie, please tell me. The way the Australian Science Media Centre has on tap many scientists who can comment on the latest breaking news stories to get them right. And it's not just finding the experts, but they need some media training, please, to give them the confidence and to get that message across simply. We're all taught as scientists, have lots of caveats and I need more data and come back later. No, we've got to tell that message straight out. So I think we all need more media training. We all would benefit from that. So that's one possibility I'd like to suggest for Atsu. And going back for the whole audience, if you get a chance to go to your school and talk science, please do that too. Please advocate for science. Okay, so that's the crisis sort of bit around communication, getting better communicators, but also in terms of talking to politicians, having the academies there, we have such wonderful experts that can provide advice to government. And obviously, I mean, I don't envy politicians right now. They've got a really hard job to do. My gosh and golly, I think we all appreciate that. But I think at the two extremes of science communication and their impact on science policy, if you go back to the HIV/AIDS crisis, my gosh, we all had our socks shaking when the Grim Reaper came on. That whole thing was run virtually all by experts, not by politicians. They stood back and it worked brilliantly. But maybe COVID is much more complicated than that. And getting that relationship right between advice on top, the way it was for HIV/AIDS, and on tap. And sometimes it isn't even on tap in some countries, we've noticed. I think that's a very important balance, and one where Atsu can play a part in making sure that the voice of politicians is really heard, of experts is heard by politicians, and we have a discussion, a conversation to make sure we get it right. And I'm going to quote from Winston Churchill, because he said, "The difference between mere management and leadership is communication." And I think that's why we're all here today.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Excellent points, very well made. And I can absolutely assure you and everyone in the audience that the Learned Academies all work together to provide rapid and relevant advice to decision makers in the federal cabinet as they're moving through this crisis, but more broadly as well. We also do train and work with organisations like the Australian Science Media Centre, other Learned Academies, Science and Technology Australia, to ensure that the media can connect with the right experts who have communications training. So I'm pleased to hear that we're singing from the same hymn sheet there. I'm also sure that Ian Chubb's got a few opinions to share on that, and probably some other stuff as well. Ian, over to you.
Mute.
Ian, you'll have to unmute your microphone.
Not something we usually have to say to you, Ian. But
Yeah, all the time, you know, put me in front of a microphone, it's always off. I don't know what's happened. Anyway, I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal Ngambie country here in Canberra, and I respect their elders past, present and future. And we can learn a lot, and they can offer a lot. And I think we should cherish it more than we do. Andrew, I agreed with virtually everything you said. If I had 2 hours, I'd go through a few words and a few phrases, which I think we do need to think about here. So I'll start off very controversially. You asked about where is Australia's ambition. It's minimised by the fact that we are risk averse and not risk assessors and managers, almost instinctively. I think the reason for that is that we've been able to dig it and ship it. We haven't had to work hard to get our GDP where it has been, because we've sold it, and we've even bought back value added
material from our own products rather than do it here because somebody somewhere has said we don't need to. My argument, if I had to put it in a word or two, I'd say partly it's because too many economists have too much say in the future of the country, and I don't think they have the capacity to think. Generally speaking, I know and I do want to say that I'm speaking very generally, but you know, you used expressions like picking winners, or you implied picking winners. Here, if you use that, you just get a shellacking from a bunch of people who wouldn't know a winner if they fell over one. But they have access to something that gives them a soapbox. You asked about where is Australia's ambition. Yeah, I know where it is. It's short term, and it rides luck. So I wrote a piece once where I started it off by talking about the first verse of our national anthem, which is what we found: girt by sea, land and bounds, natural gifts, etc. It's only in the second verse, which virtually nobody knows and has never used, where we actually talk about having to earn stuff and doing things with hearts and hands and all the rest of it to build things and to make things and to do things. The rest of it, we saw a rusty hill, we turned it into GDP. When it was empty, we went and found another rusty hill and we turned that into it. And so there's a sort of complacency abroad, and it's in the political framework particularly, where all you have to do is to encourage a bit more of that and she'll be right. So, you know, it could be the national motto, she'll be right, no worries. Lynn, you weren't quite right. There was a very serious federal minister of health in the HIV/AIDS days by the name of Neil Blewett. And you could compare and contrast the quality of the various cabinets that we've had over the years and their capacity to begin to think through what is really good and sound that will provide Australia with a future that Australians can actually enjoy, by contrast with having to look over their shoulder and say, why aren't we like them? Andrew, you talked about comparative advantage. I just don't think we pay enough attention to comparative advantage. We always talk about competitive advantage. When I was chief scientist, I got some work commissioned on comparative advantage, and they gave me a report that was basically about competitive advantage. And Australia has comparative advantages, which it can turn, and as you put it, you can turn your comparative advantage into competitive advantage. But to do that, you've got to be willing to take a risk. You've got to be willing to assess a risk and manage a risk. And I don't think that we're good at that. And certainly our political leadership overall, I'm not being party political, but our political leadership, I don't think gives me great confidence that they have the capacity to think like that. You talked about scalable. We do a lot of stuff, but it's small scale. You apply for a research grant, doesn't matter whether it's an industry translation grant or a basic research grant, it's not enough to do the work that you're actually funded to do. So you've got to go and apply another one. So our best researchers spend too much of their time trying to search out to get the money to do the work that they're capable of doing and that the country needs them to do. So we're frightened of big things. We don't think in terms of scale, and we do fund across a very broad range rather than have a coherent strategy and policy with definite vision, definite aims. I mean, if I were to ask people, what is the vision for the country that our leadership now puts out there for us to either agree with, disagree with, argue about, or whatever, and it'd be hard to find. You talked about, there was another thing I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the American SPIR program. Now, you'd be very familiar with that. I mean, it started off under Ronald Reagan. It still operates. They claim in their various reviews an average of 7 patents a day over that entire period from Ronald Reagan to now. Governments supported, made the American government the biggest venture capital funder in the world for quite a while. But the ambition was to turn their small businesses, which are bigger than our small businesses by definition, but to turn them into medium-sized enterprises and bigger. And so we run a pilot program, and we have a very small program, but it's this scalability that concerns me, that we're unwilling to take the punt and say that we can do this. One of the questions in the chat is, why aren't we making the batteries? Why aren't we building the batteries? We've got the resources to do the batteries, but we send it off, buy it back as a refined product, or buy it back as a battery. And you think, that's what we used to do in the 30s, send tin plate offshore and send out ships laden to the gunnels and then buy back tin cans, buy back ships full of air. So you get this, there's this sort of, I just find it a very frustrating time when you, as you said, where you started off post GFC, we didn't rethink how we did things. We didn't have to rethink how we did things, and we squandered an opportunity. And if we're not really careful now, I'm stopping. If we're not really careful now, so you told me to turn the microphone on. If I hadn't, you wouldn't have heard any of this. But you could have gone on with other conversation. But we do really need to begin to think through to make sure we don't squander an opportunity which the change will force us to make, or whether we just slip back into a she'll be right sort of attitude, or that too prevalent. I'm not going to say it's everywhere. Of course it's not. Of course we've got a platform to build off, and of course we're getting better in some areas. But if you think about the country as a whole, we've got to do things differently.
So Ian, I'm really glad you made that point about thinking about the country as a whole. And I'm glad that you rose renewables as well, because of course, science and technology isn't just in service of economic growth and wealth. There's also improvements to healthcare. There's improvement in social capital. And one of the questions that was posed ahead of this session, which I'd like to put to you, is what do you think about how to approach a more effective and broader public advocacy for technology in support of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, rather than necessarily in support of achieving Australia's economic dominance?
Are you asking me?
No, I'm going to ask for someone else to respond to that, and I can see Genevieve nodding.
I think you should, yes. I'll go on for another hour.
All right, Ian, that's why we keep you around. Listen, I think part of the answer there is that it's tempting to think about Australia as a single piece, whereas the reality is we are part of a complicated globe. And in some ways, COVID has made that more clear than almost anything else might have over time. The notion of interwoven systems, of supply chains, and while one of the policy temptations has been to say we need to have sovereign capacity locally, I think it also says we need to think about what our place is globally. And there are multiple global frameworks where technology and engineering makes a difference. For the Sustainability Development Goals, that's one for the SDGs. And I think it's, quite clear that that's been a complicated place for us and how we want to think about it. I think it is equally clear there are other things to think about that you can do with science and technology. It's not always about economic uplift and efficiencies. It's also about, as you said, quality of life. It's about sustainability issues. It's about how we think about managing a lot of the other quote unquote side effects of technology, which have to do with the fragmentation of social cohesion, which have to do with, ideas about what it means to be a consumer and a citizen. So for me, I think there's multiple ways of thinking about what are our responsibilities in terms of scientific and technical production, aren't just to the health of the nation state, but the health of civic and civil discourse more broadly, and then absolutely to the health of the planet. I mean, all of us started, and I was remiss in this by acknowledging where we are, which is on, lands that have, as you say, been occupied for 60,000 years with complex systems held in balance over time. And when we talk about acknowledging the traditional owners and elders of this country and thinking about what we can learn from and build on in terms of traditional knowledge, part of the notions about sustainability here are really useful ones to think about how we would manage those on a more global scale. So for me, I think there's an interesting tension between what we need to do locally, what our responsibilities are as part of a broader world, and then what our responsibilities are as part of a broader community of technologists and researchers.
Thank you. Andrew?
That's a great answer. And also everyone had great comments. So thank you for letting me occupy all that oxygen at the beginning, because, I'm learning a lot listening to these panelists, but I'm also learning a lot looking at the chat room and all the questions. So I want to try something on you which you are being provocative. So I'll go one more step, because everything you've said about risk aversity and everything we've said about communication, I think that was brilliant. Many of these things have already been defined quite well here in Australia. We are a nation full of intelligent people. We do not have people who understand science in decision-making places. The civil service doesn't have a lot of it. The politicians don't, the media doesn't. Atsu does. But the problem we're making, and that last question is indicative of it, the world used to be run in silos pretty effectively. You could get to things sequentially pretty well. Digital changed all that. And so what's happened is now we're getting collisions and creating massive discontinuities which means you need to actually respond with actually totally, firstly, fixing what it is, health crisis, but moving quickly to actually the remedy that needs to happen. How do I scale research in pharmaceuticals faster in Australia so we have the development of the next mRNA technology here? So those sorts of connect the dots are intersections that are occurring because digital is making them happen. So the geopolitical issues of our time, the sustainable development goals that were developed in the UN a few years back, you can no longer silo them. We've got to teach young people, that's why I've got this academy going in Queensland, how to actually bring the complexity to simple solutions. Enter stage left, all of you. Your scientists, your engineers, your problem solvers. For God's sakes, you are the problem solvers of the nation, okay? We need to infiltrate, we need to create some revolutions, we need to get you in power. I almost got deported from the US, that's an exaggeration, by saying in Washington once at some big press club event, this nation has for too long been run by lawyers in Washington, bankers in New York, and actors from Hollywood. That almost got me deported. I said, we're the engineers. So anyway,
I have a feeling that no one here is going to argue with the idea of scientists and technologists in political power. The question is who's going to take on that challenge. Lynn, I'm wondering if you've got some thoughts about that.
One comment I wanted to make, and it goes back to the risk assessment thing. If you look at Israel, the chief scientist, and I'm sure Ian knows this well, has a budget of about $40 million a year. They pick promising discoveries, and if they succeed, they repay the funds. If it doesn't work, they don't say they've failed, they've done fast learning for something else. And that's why we need to be less risk averse. So, and they also say to the scientists, go back and engineers, go back and discover something else and get the business managers to make sure that that idea is turned into a reality. Until I think we really engage with that early stage to get an idea to the next stage, then it's not going to work. But the other comment I wanted to make is that I think people increasingly know now that if they want their kid to get a job, they have to be science, technology, engineering, and maths savvy, because that's the way it's going. You know, if you want to work for the big resources company in WA, you're not there digging things up. You're sitting at a computer controlling something 1,000 kilometers away. So the faster we go down that route, the better. And yeah, lithium batteries, by gosh, we should be producing them. There's something also on the chat line about getting more support for researching and getting young people interested in education and science. Couldn't agree more. Maybe that's something that Atsu could advocate for.
So we know, and Ian, I will come to you in just a second, we know that in biology that a strong, a robust ecosystem is a diverse ecosystem. And for that reason, I support also your call to action, Andrew, to have more scientists and technologists in politics. But I would add to that an extra challenge, given that we have an incredibly gender imbalanced sector in science, technology, engineering and mathematics. And that is, having watched the excellent Misrepresented by Annabelle Crabb recently, it's very, very clear that women in particular are not welcome in Parliament House. How would you tackle that, Ian, those twin challenges?
Well, first I'll say something else. Something easier. My hero is Carl Sagan, and Carl Sagan once said that every child is born curious and our education systems beat it out of them. And I think we need to look at not just what we teach, but how, and how we encourage people to be curious rather than to follow a narrow gauge railway line. There was a thing on there on the chat box about lobbying. I just wanted to make a quick point, and that is, I don't think we engage enough with the community at large. Politicians change when the community forces it on them. At the moment, they get away with doing what they want because the community doesn't argue enough. So what happens to science research and so on, I think it's about a balance. I think talking to politicians, where most of the discussion has been, is of course important. And using their language back at them is critically important. Knowing your audience is critically important. But a big part of our audience is the community, and I don't think we spend enough time explaining to them why it's important. But that what we do as scientists is we give them choices. We don't tell them what to do, we give them choices. We give them choices of products to buy, implements to use, medical devices to get healthier with, whatever it is. We give choices. And the other on the chat box, Kylie, was about business. And I think, Andrew, one of the things that I would say as a former Vice-Chancellor, and indeed as Chief Scientist talking to business, getting business to lean in Australia is quite different from the way it is in America. And there is a much more, when American corporate leaders wrote an open letter to the president saying it was his job to fund the silent capital that was the underpinning of all technology and technology development, I tried to get a similar letter signed by Australian corporate bosses to send to our Prime Minister at the time, who was actively engaged in this area. It wasn't as though we were pushing it uphill, and I could not get one single one to sign, not one. And so you have a completely different atmosphere, completely different context, and somehow we've got to get that relationship between the researching sector and the business sector much more equivalent, rather than de-risking as much as you can before business is even remotely interested in talking to you, and then they want all the IP anyway and pay half the cost of actually doing the work. So you've got to have a better balance than that, and I hope we don't squander this opportunity to work to get that balance, but particularly by bringing the community much more closely in, because if they're not in, there is no pressure on the political leadership at the moment to change, and so they don't. Now, I've forgotten your earlier question.
Oh, well, that's okay. I was about to comment.
Somebody else can probably answer it. Yeah.
I was going to comment, Ian, that you've taken Lynn's advice clearly and taken media training, because you've answered the question you wanted to answer rather than the one that was asked.
That's what you do.
I think that there's a terrific question on the chat from Nicholas Mortimer, and it's the importance of storytelling and stories, and the challenge that the educational focus is increasingly on STEM skills rather than understanding and influencing culture. Now, I don't think that this is an end game where you have to choose one or the other. Personally, my opinion is that you do both, and I've got a strong suspicion that Genevieve might share that opinion.
Well, absolutely. I always find myself awkwardly located in conversations about STEM, given that my entire training is as a research social scientist. I have a PhD in cultural anthropology and was lucky enough to be apprenticed at a large tech company where they thought that having a range of different disciplinary backgrounds was actually hugely helpful to driving innovation and scientific discovery. And, you know, for me at Intel, it was a virtue that I had a background in the social sciences. It was considered to be a helpful and useful thing. And when you push people and ask them about why they found it to be thus, partly it was because I had a different point of view in the room in a company full of engineers. It was good to be someone who wasn't. And I think partly as I was trained to ask a completely different set of questions. And when I think about when we talk about all of the threats that have been coming out over the last hour, right, about how do you help shape public conversation? How do you change the minds of government and policymakers and CEOs? How do you bring the public along on that journey? All of that is not just about the rigor of our activities, but also the way we know how to connect it to what it is that people care about in a vernacular people understand. And, you know, when I talk to companies here and in the US about who they want to employ, their expectation is that at universities, we will turn out people who are experts in their fields, but their expectation is also that we will teach them to be able to be good collaborators and team workers, that they'll be invested in the success of others, not just themselves, that they'll be able to do project work, that they'll be able to work with people who weren't trained in the same things as them, and that they'll be able to handle things like rapid transformation and ambiguity and, well, effectively all the things that the last year and a half manifested. And I think one of our challenges in how we communicate the value of science to the public, both as a you should send your kids to do this and you should listen to it when it comes around you, is how we not just talk about the what of it, but the why of it, and how we make it accessible. And, you know, part of what Lynn and Ian both had in common as remarkable chief scientists was their ability to make science, I think you said simple, not simplistic was the line, right? But to make it accessible and something that was incredibly, that you wanted to be part of. And I know it's been part of Andrew's lived work too, right? So there's a bit here about if you want to make science and technology and engineering sing, it's not just about the pieces of the puzzle, it's about how you tell the story about why it is, right? And so for me, that is about what are the stories we tell? Who are the people we have as our heroes? So, you know, everyone's mentioned someone that they really admire in that space. So who are the heroes and why do we make those heroic stories? You know, what are the stories we want to tell about big successes? Those all feel like they're important pieces of the puzzle, right? And to the bit of the question that Ian didn't answer for you, Kylie. And part of doing that is to have a different pantheon, right? Because when you have a different collection of stories and different set of heroes in that story, it's easier for women, for people who come from different kinds of backgrounds to see themselves in that pantheon and not think, well, they don't look like me.
Thank you so much, Genevieve. And look, we are at time, so I'm going to beg your indulgence, audience, and ask each of the panelists, and it's going to be probably the hardest challenge you have had this afternoon. I'm going to ask you to say one sentence, one thing that you hope that the audience walks away with and remembers from this event. Lynn.
Support teachers, get science taught differently in schools, and tell politicians it's an investment to go into science, technology, engineering and maths because it saves money in the long term.
Thank you very much. Andrew.
Tomorrow I have at the University of Queensland Leadership Academy a scientist speaking to my students. His name is Will I Am from Black Eyed Peas. He's a scientist, but he's a celebrity and he's a musician and he's all those other things. What I was saying before is not scientists to run for office, Kylie. You didn't get my message. My message is be the messenger, not just the message content. We are all messengers. These panelists have sent great messages today. All these questions are great messages, okay? But you are the messengers. You've got to get out there, okay? We can't just sit in our enclaves.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Ian, one thing.
One thing, be a bold and courageous in your advocacy. Andrew mentioned bold and courageous in leadership. We are all leaders if we want to be, and we all have to be bold and courageous, because if we're not, nothing will happen. And we'll all go back and put another prawn on the barbie.
And Genevieve.
Wow, I don't know how to follow Ian. I keep getting stuck in that position. I think the answer for me is it's never just science by itself. Is that, you know, the virtue of science is how it connects up across lots of other stories. So tell the story and bring a whole lot of other people on that journey with you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and expertise, fellows of the Academy of Technology and Engineering, and our esteemed visitors and audience members from all kinds of places across Australia and all kinds of sectors and ages. Thank you very much for being a part of this. I really appreciate all of the time and the thought and the wisdom that you've shared with us all today. So thank you.